You're listening to Boobies and Newbies, brought to you by the Frolic Podcast Network. Welcome to Boobies and Newbies, the podcast that asks novice romance readers to think outside the dick in a box and brave the unbridled world of erotica. I'm your host, Kelly Reynolds, and it's time for another Steamy Spotlight author interview. Joining me today is none other than Rosie Danan. Rosie's debut novel, The Roommate, received tremendous praise from readers and critics alike. The New York Times called The Roommate a book about people expanding into their best possible selves, warmly funny and gorgeously sexy. Beyond that, The Roommate was named a Best Book of the Year by such publications as NPR, BuzzFeed, Apple Books, Bustle, and Refinery29, and it already has been optioned for film. Here to discuss her latest work, a companion book to The Roommate called The Intimacy Experiment, is the author herself, Rosie Danan. Welcome, Rosie.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. Super excited.
Oh, I'm excited to have you. And I have to begin this chat by asking how I feel like I begin every interview at this point, which is, how you doing? How's everything going?
You know what? I'm actually doing pretty well today. It's funny, earlier in the pandemic, I stopped kind of posturing. And if people asked, I kind of went with fine. Whereas like pre-pandemic, I would not say fine because normally fine, there's a follow-up of like, oh, okay. Like what's wrong? Like
what's wrong?
From being a good. But I just, don't know that there were that many moments in the pandemic where I was feeling generally good. So, but today has actually been really nice. We ordered in some Chinese food and we're going to watch Dirty Dancing. And I've been looking forward to that all week. So I feel comfortable saying that it's a good Sunday. So.
Oh yeah. Order in Chinese food and Dirty Dancing is like beyond fine in my book.
Absolutely. Yeah, it definitely transcends most days.
Now, important follow-up question. Have you seen Dirty Dancing 2 Havana Nights?
I haven't. I'm a pretty hardcore, purist. My devotion to Dirty Dancing is very extreme. So if watching Havana Nights would dilute that, I would try to avoid it, which like I said, I haven't seen it, but I've heard that it doesn't necessarily live up to the original. So I'm the same way with I've never seen Speed 2. I've never seen the sequel to Romancing the Stone. I was just talking with my friends about that. I just want to bask in the glory of the original work. And then I just pretend the sequels were never made.
Wow. Yeah. And those are 3 very memorable sequels in very different ways. Speed 2 is by far one of the worst films you will ever see in your life. But it's still delightful nonetheless, because it's so bad. And then the sequel to Romancing the Stone is Jewel of the Nile, which I personally happen to love that one. I don't think it's as good as Romancing the Stone, but you get more Joan Wilder and, Jack and their adventures. So I'm a fan of that one. That is the one of those 3 sequels that I would actually recommend.
Okay. I will definitely take that under advisement because I'm always nervous to bring in, I've just been burned by a lot of sequels, the Kingsman sequel. I don't know if you've seen that.
Oh, yes, you're right. And you know what? I had such high expectations because Kingsman was so good.
Exactly. I watched Kingsman. I was like, I love this. The sequel was out. So I was like, cue it up, right after. And I think I turned it off within 20 minutes because I was like, it's hurting the original. And I
know. Well, they set such high expectations for us. You gotta deliver on those.
I guess that's a funny setup for the intimacy. I hope that
I was gonna say
no
this
pressure.
is such an excellent segue too to talk about your book. Because no pressure. It is. Obviously you did receive such high praise for The Roommate, which was your debut novel, no less, that I'm sure there was probably a lot of pressure on yourself to live up to what The Roommate became, right? With The Intimacy Experiment?
It's funny. I wrote The Intimacy Experiment before The Roommate came out and was like widely available to readers, which I think was good and actually was kind of like advice that I'd heard from other people. And just because of the way the publishing schedule was, I was able to turn it in like in February of last year. So well before The Roommate came out in September. And I think that was good because I didn't have as much of I didn't know what the response would be. So I wasn't like using that as a barometer for how to develop the work. I will say that's like much harder now. Having having The Roommate. It's so funny because I think in publishing, it's really hard to find like emotional stability, I'll say, just because, the lows are hard, but in some ways, like the highs can also set you up to kind of get off kilter.
Yes.
So I'm definitely nervous, I guess, to see. I don't think The Intimacy Experiment will necessarily be received in the exact same way, but in some ways I think that's good because I will say by design, they're very different books. I think they're united in a lot of ways. Like obviously my writing hopefully is consistent in terms of voice, but like thematically they're different, and in heat level they're different. In like The Intimacy Experiment isn't necessarily a comedy, whereas I would say The Roommate is unabashedly a rom-com. So I think maybe that helps. I think sometimes, going back to our sequel conversation around movies, maybe that's where they fall down sometimes, is they're trying to recreate the magic in the same way. Whereas I would say The Intimacy Experiment is more about me flexing different muscles and giving readers a different view of what I can do. And so, certainly some people will say this is not for them or they prefer one or the other. But my goal would be like, to sort of build a more well-rounded picture. Because that's sort of how I feel about authors that I really admire, is I like to see them, explore different territories, and then people find out like which books of theirs are speaking to them in the best way.
No, I love what you said. Is it's less about kind of living up to like the hype of the first book, but more of sort of showcasing different skill set, different themes, because if you're just trying to recreate the first book or the first movie or whatever it is in a franchise, then I feel like you're setting yourself up for failure. So it sounds like you went the right route of saying, this is obviously, you've called it a companion book to The Roommate. However, it's not The Roommate. It's a whole different book.
Totally. Yeah. And I think there's a lot that I enjoyed about having it be a companion, in the sense that it follows Naomi, who's a character that we meet in The Roommate that I had a ton of heart for. I think readers had a lot of heart for. So in that way, it was very rich to kind of shift perspective and to get inside of her head, because I think when you're outside of her head, she can be maybe a bit more mysterious. And then, so this is going to be a chance for people to really understand how she works. The other fun thing about a companion book is you get to see Josh and Clara, and you get to see them at a different phase of their relationship, and their business at a different phase of its evolution. So all of that is really rewarding.
Yeah, I agree. And obviously, like, if you haven't read The Roommate, I think you can read The Intimacy Experiment on its own. However, you'll get that full enriched experience having read both of them together.
Yes, I definitely think it can be read as a standalone, which again, I think is the objective. Like, as a huge romance reader, sometimes I will come into a series not as the first book. Like I kind of love that about series, though, again, where it's like people will recommend the one to you that they think most aligns with your interests. So sometimes, if it's a series of 4 books or whatever, they're like, okay, you're going to go in on book 3, and maybe our other friend is going to go in on book 2 or whatever. And yeah, I like that they can flex, you know what I mean? Either you can get the extra dimension of reading the first book, or maybe you'll go back to the first book after the second.
Yeah, and that's what usually happens for me, is I more often than not will start a series in the middle and then think, oh, wait, these people are already together. That means they
Yeah.
have a book before this one. I have to go back and read it.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're like, am I into their dynamic? Like, okay, let's see how that like came together. Or there'll be like a hint where it'll be like, you know, they used to be at each other's throats and now they're together. And then I'm like, okay, I got to figure out how that happened.
I have to know. Well, okay, I do want to talk more about the book, but first I want to bring you back a little bit because you mentioned that you're an avid romance reader as well. I think that's to be expected of most writers, and I'd love to know how your relationship with romance began. If you remember when you started reading romance novels and when you started writing them.
It's definitely like a very, very early age. I can't remember. I'm like what came first, either like romantic books or romantic movies, because I've like ingested so as much romance as I can. But I do remember like from a relatively early age going with my dad to the bookstore, and I would look for the books with pink covers because they tended to have like a romantic relationship in them.
Love it.
And it's funny, like the roommate has a pink cover and
pink.
That was not my choice. Like the publisher kind of sent that to me and I was like, yes, we're going to signal to everyone that this is a kissing book. And
it was meant to be.
Yeah. So that was like really a full circle moment for me. But, yeah, like in anything that I ever read, even if it was like, middle grade, like Ella Enchanted. I don't know if you've read that. It's like such a classic. But it's a middle grade book, but it's very romantic in a totally age appropriate way. Yes. And after that, I was just always like, okay, so where can I get the ratio of romance to be even larger in the book? And yeah, I read YA romance. And then as soon as I figured out that if you went to the general fiction and got the kind of adult books that they would be doing more stuff, I was like, okay, I'll go over there now. So, I will say like when I was younger, it was like less of an understanding that this is a whole genre. And because the way that the bookstores are so, and even the libraries are like, they used to just hide the romance section.
I was about to say the way you set that up where you're like, I would wander over to general fiction to find romance. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's right. There's still in this day too many bookstores and libraries for that matter that don't separate out romance, mystery, science fiction. Like I don't understand why we're trying to lump them all together in general fiction.
Well, you know what the funny thing is, and I actually think this is like a huge problem that's maybe starting to shift, is the bookstore that I grew up going to did have a romance section, but as a young adult, so maybe like 12, 13, it was like literally in my mind, like going to like the brown paper bag like section of the magazine rack, or like going to like the back room in a video store. Like it was like that is I knew what it was. I knew that those books were about kissing, obviously, because they had, you know, the people in the very obviously desirous poses, like the clinch and stuff we talk about all the time. But I was like, well, kids or like young people can't be seen going over there because you're basically announcing to the world what you're up to. And it was like, that's a toxic idea, but it's just how I felt, especially going to the bookstore with my dad. And he was like paying for the book. So he'd always like look at it and be like, well, what's this about? I remember he found a Gossip Girl book that I had, and he was like, this is about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. He literally said that to me. So there was just like a lot of stigma, whereas, you know, there's so many conversations about illustrated covers and stuff like that. But I do think when you go to a romance section now, you are seeing that shift on the shelves. And that I don't think this topic gets picked up as much, but that may help younger readers feel more comfortable going into that section and taking home books. And obviously that's something that I think is really important and good. So it's a tricky subject. I think there's a lot of nuance to it, but I fall on I grew up picking the illustrated covers because, again, they did feel more accessible to me as a younger entrant into the romance
Yeah.
genre.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I hadn't really thought about that perspective appealing to like younger readers. Like I know even speaking with, I speak with romance reading newbies all the time on this podcast, and most of them admit to a sense of embarrassment or shame of carrying around a romance novel for fear that someone would see the cover. And these are grown ass adults. And so it didn't even occur to me thinking about younger audiences wanting to pick up a book and having that same sense of fear or dread. And I would assume it would be even amplified. It would be so much greater as a kid or a teenager.
Yeah, I mean, again, it gets into like all of these issues, and I think about this a lot because not only do I think about the genre a lot, but I'm very like self-analytical, and yeah, it gets into this whole idea of when are we still live in a quite like a puritanical society, and especially when it's sex outside of the traditional like cishet male gaze, it makes people super uncomfortable. And so I feel like access to, and this is all like some of the reasons I wrote The Roommate, like access to sex education in this country, in the US, is terrible. And so
oh yeah,
it's just like you want to learn about these things, and it's not a bad thing. It's a totally like healthy, normal part of development to want to understand intimacy and connection and sexuality. And I think romance novels can be really successful models of healthy dynamics.
I do
but
too.
We don't want people to be around them, and we continue to stigmatize them and call them smut and porn and all of these different things because they don't meet this type of gaze that's been accepted in mass media. And that is such a bummer.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, sex education in the United States is, whew, man, there's a whole podcast that we could talk about just on that. But I think most sex educators and, teachers, like I feel like most people would agree that, we've seen the studies where they've shown that like abstinence only education, there's higher pregnancy rates and higher STD rates and everything as a result of that education, because kids aren't learning and they're not talking about things. And because they're not talking about them, they don't know how to prepare for them. It's this cycle that is just so dangerous and so uninformed. And I'm going to step off my soapbox right now.
No, I'm applauding over here. Like I definitely, I think that access to education about sex and intimacy and body development and all of that stuff is so important. And, there are some emerging resources and some well-established resources like Planned Parenthood and things like that, like people who are doing great work in these areas. Yeah. But it's just so frustrating that the stigma around the romance genre continues to put up barriers from that being a tool in media that allows us to, again, have those like healthy models or dynamic models. Because I think when you don't have that access, you learn from things that are not good. Like if you look at old romantic comedies and their models of intimacy, like a lot of times they're super problematic. And to your point, like kids are not just kids, like any of us, like we're going to continue to seek information from the sources that are readily available. So it's like whatever we can do, if it's changing the packaging, if it's starting more reader groups, if it's things like this podcast that are going to help people to realize that maybe some of the things they think about the genre are misconceptions, I'm all for it.
Me too. I absolutely agree. Well, and I also love that you mentioned like it's not just about the sex, it's about the intimacy and relationships, because I think obviously the book is called The Intimacy Experiment, and I think that's something that we don't talk enough about. We talk about like sex and dating, but then it's like, what comes next? What are the moments of intimacy? Because I really do think that's something that we've lost with like modern technology and the whole like online dating atmosphere. So I'd love to know where the idea for this specific book came from.
The origins of this is very like insider look at the process, I guess. But like I wrote the roommate and I wrote Naomi into it, obviously. Mm-hmm. And people really liked her character. I really liked her character. It was always somebody that I was like, I want her to have the happily ever after that she deserves. Like, would love to write her book, but I was really intimidated by her as a character. So I had actually planned like a different second book in the series. And I was like, let Naomi be the third book. Like, let's put some more exit ramp here before I have to start figuring out who she should be with. And both my agent and my editor were like, no, like it's Naomi's book. Like,
pay attention to Naomi.
Yeah, they were like, this is what the people want. So I had a really short amount of time actually to figure out like who she should be opposite. And it was really hard for me because I was like, I just have so much affection for her and she's such a sort of dynamic person in my head. And I just was like, I don't know who's the person that she's supposed to love. And I felt like I was running through like infinite variables. And I think I was like a little bit punch drunk. I had been traveling a lot and I was sort of jet lagged at the time. And I was like, oh my God, wouldn't it be so funny if it was like a hot rabbi? Like that would be so funny. And I was like, it was the kind of idea sort of similar to when I first thought of the roommate where I was like, and her roommate's a porn star, where I was like, he, like, I can't get away with that. Like, I am not brave enough to do that. And I texted my agent. Actually, no, I was talking to my family first. I did. This is the one wisdom that I had is like, don't tell anyone in publishing that you might want to put a rabbi as the love interest. Until you talk to your Jewish family and figure out if that's okay. So I called on this business trip for my day job. I like called my family and was like, listen, I want to have an open-ended conversation about something that I'm thinking about. They knew I was writing. And I said to them, I want to have potentially a rabbi be the love interest. Like, what do you think about that? Would that ever be okay? And I was talking to my aunt at the time and she literally like while I'm on the phone with her starts texting. She's like, I'm texting the rabbi. Like I'm talking to our rabbi right now.
Got to go straight to the source.
I was so embarrassed. I was like, oh my God, he is not going to be okay with this. This is going to be a nightmare. And he came right back and was like, who are we to stand in the way of love? And I was like, oh, fuck, I'm writing this book. Like,
I love this.
He just was like, it's easier if she's Jewish, but like, it's fine either way. And, you know, let me know how it goes. And he's not even like somebody that I would have said is super flexible. It was like somebody that was just very much like, I think that's maybe a misconception that people have who are not Jewish or are not super familiar with Judaism. They think that it is that like having a rabbi as the love interest is similar to having a priest. And it's not at all. Like there's not rules against intimacy in the same way. It's very different perspectives and it's not taboo in the same way.
Yeah.
It is a position of responsibility. But I would liken it more to like a politician or somebody who has like a community respected role.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, is it seems like it's more of a responsibility to their community as it is like a responsibility to like a deity or like, you know, like this is me representing God.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is like religious aspects of that role, but the religion doesn't police sex and intimacy in the same way that Catholicism can, or other religions. I just use Catholicism because again, people do tend to make that like priest analogy.
So the rabbi was on board though, so it seems like, you know, that was like the go ahead.
Yeah, so we got the all clear from the rabbi, which I don't think any of us were expecting, and then my family was kind of like, oh, okay. I actually like have a lot of family that like is very like Jewish studies oriented too. So like not just like Jewish by heritage, but like very like involved in different communities and stuff like that. So another member of my family has like a leadership role in sort of Jewish community organizations and interacts with rabbis a lot as well. So I reached out to her. Like I really wanted to do my due diligence to make sure I was not going to get in big trouble. Her immediate reaction was also really funny. She was like, oh, like a lesbian rabbi, like it's a lesbian romance, because she knew that I guess Naomi was bisexual, and I was like, oh, actually no, like I was thinking of a man. But it was just funny, like they were just much more open to the idea than I think I was originally anticipating. And so I kind of got the all clear in that area, and then pitched it to my agent and my editor, again, kind of thinking that somebody would stop me and just be like, oh, we don't think that's a great idea. And they did not. They were like, we love this. Like, please make him a rabbi. And the reason I really wanted to make him a rabbi again is because I just think Naomi deserves somebody that would love her in the way that I thought she deserved to be loved. And so it was really about this person that would be able to like love her mind, body, and soul, if you will. And I just have a lot of respect again for the people. I've known some great rabbis and stuff like that. So that's where that came about. But then I had to figure out like, how am I going to get them together? And, you know, Naomi doesn't have organized religion as like a part of her life when we meet her in The Roommate. So, but I knew that she wanted to teach. I knew that she was really interested in this kind of holistic idea of intimacy, because she is studying for her master's in The Roommate. And so this idea of connection and the evolution of connection felt like an intersection that a modern rabbi and Naomi, the established character, would share as interest. And so that's sort of how the idea for the seminar series was born, as a way to bring them together.
Well, and I think that's pretty natural that there are so many sex workers who become sex educators or speakers, or, you know, they start organizations or podcasts or anything. So, I mean, it seems like a natural step for somebody who in The Roommate we meet as a sex worker to progress with their studies.
Yes. And it was very much like a conversation that I was having with people who either had were working in the sex were working in sex industries right now, or had done so in the past, where they definitely talked about it being a passion project to kind of share what they knew, but that they had run into issues trying to get opportunities to have more mainstream platforms for education. So I think that is a challenge, where a lot of times they do feel like they have to start something themselves, right? Like, and it's great. Like, there are a lot of mediums now where we can have, whether it's on social media or, like you were saying, like a podcast, or we build a website or something. But for Naomi, she had just gone through that whole practice building Shameless in over the course of The Roommate. So it's kind of like she wants to break into a traditional model. She wants somebody else to have built the infrastructure for her to be able to reach people. And it's also sort of a point of pride. Like, she's constantly battling stigma and proving people wrong. So that's sort of why she does go into a traditional channel.
Yeah. Well, and so you mentioned that, you know, you had spoken to, you know, either current or former sex workers. And I'm wondering what the research process was like for not just this book, but also The Roommate, you know, a series that largely follows the sex work industry and also seeks to destigmatize sex work. That's clearly one of the themes that I took away from both the Intimacy Experiment and The Roommate. So what was the research like for these books?
Yeah, no, that's definitely absolutely a goal, to have like a more good, to go beyond the stigma and to really give voices to perspectives of people who have worked in the industry or are working in the industry. Because that's what I realized is, a lot of times when I think about the way society views sex work, it's so much about their outsider perspective, and it's very rarely listening to the experiences or the needs of the people in the industry. And that's why so many people, you know, want to outlaw it or something like that, where it's like, no, that's going directly against the needs of the people who are working there. But there are a tremendous amount of resources of people who are working in the adult entertainment industry, for example, where they're sharing their perspectives. People just don't necessarily look for them. So I did, you know, a fair amount of research through books and articles and things like that. Reddit AMAs is something where people share a lot of their firsthand experiences. And then I did actually work with a current performer and had like an open dialogue, and also had him read through the material for the roommate and
Nice.
get his perspective on it and things like that. And then for the intimacy experiment, it was also about adding in this element of not only do I not have the lived experience as a sex worker, I don't have the lived experience as a rabbi. So kind of a similar perspective in the sense that I needed to read firsthand perspectives. I needed to have conversations with people. I needed to make sure that they were reviewing the writing. So in both cases, it was kind of about taking industries that are not really widely understood. And in often cases, like I was saying, outsiders are painting pictures of what they believe occupations to be. And really, I think in both cases, again, whether it's the sex work perspective or potentially the rabbi perspective, people may be surprised by what they read.
I agree. And that's so interesting because obviously we know how often people stigmatize sex work and sex in general, but I didn't really think about the fact that how many people are able to really, describe the lived in experience of being a rabbi.
Yeah. I mean, I think both for people who are Jewish and certainly obviously for people who are not Jewish or not close to someone who's Jewish, they may have very little information to go off of. And obviously, again, in both scenarios, it's not like one perspective or viewpoint is universal. And I hope people will obviously keep that in mind as well. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting too, obviously, to be writing the intimacy experiment where, culturally we're at a point in my lifetime where anti-Semitism has never been higher or more prevalent. Like certainly as a Jewish person, I've never felt more aware of it in my lifetime. So, I think there will be people who maybe don't want to read the book because of that, but hopefully it can also do work to break down barriers in a similar way that I hope that the roommate may have been able to do that a little bit for the adult entertainment.
I think so, especially since it seems like your journey to writing this book and like consulting with the rabbi and, getting all your facts straight and everything, it almost mirrors the story within the book itself with Naomi, wanting to share these intimacy lessons on dating and relationships with, a Jewish community center that isn't really sure what to expect when she gets started, but then it potentially will bring in more and more people. So I'm thinking maybe this is the time to, make Judaism sexy again.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think like the goal with all of these stories is for people to realize how much nuance and variety there is. And for Ethan and Naomi, especially in the intimacy experiment, one of the things that unites them, for all the ways they probably look really different from one another on paper, is they are building the communities that they want to see in the world.
Yes.
And so I think it's been really interesting, like hearing from some early Jewish readers and stuff. The Jewish experience is incredibly varied, but it's been interesting to hear from people who have said either this does in some ways mirror my experiences, but even more so people who have said, I haven't necessarily found this portion of the Jewish community in my life, but this is making me want to re-explore my connection to being Jewish. And that's sort of like the journey that I was going on that made me want to write this as well. And a big theme of the intimacy experiment, right, is like the intersection of identity. How do we reconcile different roles that we have in the world? How do we reconcile different viewpoints of ourselves that we, who we've been, who we want to be.
Right.
And I think you see the convergence of that for both Ethan and Naomi
Well, and speaking as a non-Jewish reader, I will say that I think something that everybody is looking for after a year of being at home and not seeing friends and family and going about our lives the way we're used to them, I think we're all looking for connection. And I think this will touch on that in so many ways that regardless of your faith, you will absolutely see connections being built, and it'll make you want to seek out connections as well.
Yes, it's always so interesting. Like I was telling you, like this book was written well before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then a weird thing about being a writer or an artist is like you don't control when your art is perceived. And so it's very interesting to have written a book pre-pandemic and know that it's being read by people who've been living through a pandemic for more than a year.
Yeah.
And I think I got, lucky in a sense, although that's a funny
word
to use.
To say lucky, but I knew exactly where you were going with that. I'm like, I know you want to say lucky, but I know it's going to seem weird to say. Well, it's kind of like, it reminds me of when the 2016 elections happened here in the United States, and almost immediately after the election was when the first season of Handmaid's Tale came out on Hulu, and it seemed like a scary but perfect time for a show like that to become available.
Yeah, again, like you have no control over that as the creator, but it is very interesting. Like there's a line in The Intimacy Experiment where Naomi and Ethan are kind of talking about like, why do they want to create this seminar around modern intimacy? Why is that a worthwhile pursuit? And they're talking about how collectively on a sociological level, we are more lonely as a society than we have ever been. And
Amen.
Now I think about that, and it's like, that was before the pandemic. It is certainly true post-pandemic. And so, a book about exploring the ways that we build relationships with one another, I hope will be something that's valuable as we all experience kind of the roller coaster of isolation. And then hopefully in the near future, coming out of that. And because I'm nervous about that. I don't know about you, but
I am.
It's weird. Like I've developed a lot of, I think, like new anxieties about, I can't really imagine what it's going to be like the first time I'm in a large group of people again.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I think about this all the time, and it's something that I'm both really anxious about, but also in a way kind of looking forward to, where I'm just thinking about like, what's dating gonna look like after this? What's sex gonna look like after this? This meaning not your book, but although I do think that is a part of it as well. But after the pandemic, are we still gonna be the Tinder swipe generation, or is it gonna be something new? Are people gonna explore building intimate connections by, talking over the phone and chatting before they jump into bed together? Like I do see that there is going to be something changing. I don't know what yet, but I know that there's gotta be change that comes out of this as far as intimacy and relationships goes.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the other things I was thinking about when I was writing The Intimacy Experiment is like, there is not like a guidebook or a lot of access to a roadmap for building relationships. And it was a funny position to put myself in as an author, where I had to sort of think about if that was something that was being offered, what could it look like? And we talked about the lack of sex ed, but again, intimacy is so much more than sex. And there's so much that nobody teaches you how to do about relationships, and you have to kind of learn through trying, which is fine. But I really liked this idea that we could learn with each other, and we could learn as a community about where we want to take intimacy, and we could share feedback and experiences and ask questions. And I think that could be really valuable, again, coming out of the pandemic, because it's like, the rules have changed in a lot of ways.
Well, Naomi's seminar is something that like I would definitely want to take, like especially coming out of the pandemic, because I am just like, I feel like navigating dating and relationships is so difficult to begin with. And then you add on this whole extra layer. So I'm curious if you, whether it's through Rosie's eyes or Naomi's eyes, have any specific words of wisdom on modern intimacy practices that you'd like to share with listeners?
That's so funny. I mean, certainly if I did, it's in the book. I felt like, you're like bleeding a stone in that sense. Like, what can I put out there that I think will help people? I will say like without giving things away, because there's definitely like specific pieces of advice that I think you'll find through the seminars that Naomi shares that I hope are valuable for people. They were valuable for me. But I would say like trying to avoid spoilers somewhat and from an overarching layer. I think that Naomi's journey is one about learning that vulnerability is actually the bravest thing you can do. Like the bravest thing that you can really do is to strip off your armor again and again and again and let someone see who you are. And that's, I think like for me has been one of the core things that I've learned about what intimacy can be. I am just sort of like naturally have grown into somewhat of a guarded person. And that idea of putting out a tough exterior in order to protect myself was something that held a lot of appeal for me for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's only, I think, you think that being tough is the hardest it can get. And then you realize like it is so much harder to give all of yourself to someone and allow them to potentially break your heart. So I think it's just, radical vulnerability is my recommendation if you are trying to find modern intimacy, is just like as much as you are able to try to go forward with the sense that that getting hurt is not the worst thing that can happen to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like we need to have radical vulnerability printed on like buttons and t-shirts and stuff. Like I am radically vulnerable. Like I really need that.
Yeah. No, that's a good one. Maybe we'll add that to the sort of shameless tagline.
Swag.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because it's like when the first book came out, a lot of people were like, I really wish that Shameless were real. I wish that there was like a website that I could go on or to recommend to people that was about exploring what physical intimacy looks like. And so this is sort of like the second time I think that I've inadvertently created like a business opportunity for myself that I have no intention of fulfilling.
Well, I mean, never say never.
True. You never. That was actually almost the title of this book. How funny is that? The original title for The Roommate was Never Have I Ever.
Oh, which feels appropriate. Like, if you've read the book, it'll make perfect sense. Why?
Yeah, so this was very, very early days, but I thought that all the titles would have the word never in them. And so Ethan and Naomi's book was going to be Never Say Never. So it's funny that you.
Ooh, I love it. That's fantastic. Again, meant to be. But no, I love what you said too, because I feel like, especially as women, it's almost like a double-edged sword. Like we're told to be like, you have to be strong, you have to be guarded, because if you're not, then you're weak. And if you're not putting up, defenses and building yourself up bigger, then people are going to tear you down. So it's such a tough space to be in. But I think the idea about being vulnerable, I totally understand why it's so terrifying, because I think too often we confuse vulnerability with weakness, and it's not. It is, just like you said, it takes so much courage to be vulnerable.
Yes, and to keep doing it. I think that's the thing too. If vulnerability was like jumping off a high dive and the kind of thing where you only had to face that fear once,
yeah,
that might be okay. But at least in my experience, like having a meaningful relationship, and it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship, it could be a friendship or whatever, it is constantly, removing that armor, going through that exercise of like, my impulse is to run or my impulse is to shut down or whatever, but I am going to keep standing here. And again, I think that's really one of the key lessons that Naomi learns in this book.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's a great takeaway that, readers can think about as well. So obviously, I'll say it again, the Intimacy Experiment is available April 6th. That's coming up, my birthday month. So of course, I'm very excited. And I do want to say, do you have any other books planned in this particular series? Because I know you mentioned the idea of there being like a book before Naomi. So I'm wondering if there's more to come.
I will say there is not additional books in the sort of Shameless series planned at this time. I am working on 2 other books for Berkeley. But the next one, which has been announced, tentatively titled Not Ready to Make Nice, after the Chicks song.
Love it.
If you're familiar. Yeah. I lovingly call it my 90K epilogue to the song Goodbye Earl.
Oh my God.
It's a very different book. It is, but it's been really fun. So yeah, I definitely would be interested in potentially revisiting this series. It's been a really fun cast of characters to play with, but the next book will be a bit of a departure.
Okay, fair enough. Well, and I have to say, it's so funny. Like, you can tell, how long of a fan you've been of the Chicks, whether you think of them as the Chicks or the Dixie Chicks. And if you think of them with Goodbye Earl versus like their latest album, like Goodbye Earl was my introduction to the Chicks. So that holds a very special place in my heart because that music video is everything.
Oh my gosh, yeah. It's actually so hard for me to train myself to not call them the Dixie Chicks.
I know.
They took it out for the right reasons,
yes.
Absolutely. So I'm trying to reinforce the new brand.
No, as we should. Yeah. So I'm excited for that project then, especially now knowing that it is a follow-up to Goodbye Earl.
Yes. I mean, I think we all wanted to know sort of like, what did those best friends get up to after? What's their life look like? Are they getting away with it? So yeah, it's been super scary to write something different and kind of bring this conversation full circle. It's much scarier now that some people have read the book, The Roommate, and, have thoughts and feelings about it potentially one way or another. So my relationship with writing, I should say, is constantly evolving.
Good.
And again, like that theme that we were just talking about like trying to remain vulnerable, like that's something that feels very relevant to writing for me, is because, as soon as your work becomes publicly available, you have critics.
Of course.
In a lot of ways, it feels like writing books is offering your heart up to people. So I'm going to, try to, maybe I'll get a radical vulnerability like tattoo or a pin or something at least so I can keep writing.
Yeah. See, before you know it, you're going to be launching Shameless and all the swag that goes with it.
Yes. The Berkeley team, actually, keep an eye out. They made these really fun, like, Instagram stickers with all of these shameless phrases. So that's going to be going live, I would guess, in the next couple of weeks. So I don't know if it'll be before or after this episode, but if you are on social media, on Instagram, you can check out at Rosie Danan, and you get your own sort of saying that will encourage you to stay vulnerable.
What a great way to promo the book. That's fantastic. So, okay, well, we're just about to wrap things up, but first, Rosie, I want to ask you, obviously this is a podcast in which I typically interview newbie romance readers. And so I'm wondering, do you have any advice that you'd want to offer to newbie romance readers?
To readers, I would say the romance genre is incredibly varied. And that's one of the things I love about it is there are so many sub-genres that have their own set of tropes and, super talented writers and stuff. So if you have found entry into the genre through contemporary books or Regency, I just encourage you to try something new, try a paranormal, get freaky with that. There's just a lot of fun stuff in that area. I think people can get intimidated, but I'm excited because I think paranormal's been making a resurgence lately.
Yes.
So
you never know what you're going to discover about what you like, what you like to read, but maybe something sexy that you didn't know about yourself. I mean, who knows? Like I just encourage everyone to read as much as possible, and they're not all going to be winners, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Like, so for newbie readers, I actually have a friend that I've been kind of slowly converting to the romance genre. And I will often like assign her a book that I'm like, this is going to be polarizing. And like, if you love it, then that will tell us a lot about where to go next. And if you hate it, it'll equally tell us a lot about where to go next. So yeah, like I think if you're a more seasoned romance reader making recommendations, sometimes you got to throw in one of those where you're like, love it or hate it. Well, it'll set the map for future recommendations.
I love that. That's excellent advice that I am absolutely going to take to heart for sure. So last question for you before I let you go, and that is there a story that you are dying to write?
I mean, the one that I'm working on now, the Goodbye Earl epilogue, is, my lifetime in the making.
That's
like
the one.
Yeah, I was definitely a fan from a very young age. I will also say, like, in each of my romance novels, I try to put a message for myself, like something that I want to learn or process. And it's like that way, even if everyone hates the book, it's valuable to me personally, because you invest like a year of your life in this. So what's interesting about this third book that I'm working on now is I don't feel like I fully learned the lesson that I'm trying to send to myself with this one yet. Whereas I think in the Roommate and the Intimacy Experiment, it was about looking back and saying, this is something that I have processed. Mm-hmm. And this one is very much like the act of processing. So that will be a totally new adventure for me. So in a lot of ways, this book is really challenging. I think I'm 3 for 3 in saying like, this is the hardest thing I'll ever do, but that is worthwhile to me as an endeavor. So.
And it should be. You should love the work that you write. It drives me nuts when writers tear down their own work. So yeah, kudos to you for writing yourself secret messages and, enjoying your own books. Like that's what we should all be doing.
I think everyone has their own process and everyone deals with the sort of like public being perceived element of being a writer in different ways. And I'm certainly not saying that my way would work for everyone, but that is something that I've learned that has been helpful to me to kind of like have more internal value in the work so that the external stuff can, either be a pleasant surprise or can be something that you can kind of like write off as like, if it doesn't stop in your station, it's not your train kind of thing.
Well, there's the positive message that I want to end this episode on. So what a way to cap things off. But Rosie, thank you so much for joining me today. This was an absolute delight to talk about, everything from the Roommate to the Intimacy Experiment to destigmatizing sex work. We got deep there for a while. So I appreciate your willingness to talk about your work and what inspires you and what's up next.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation.
Fabulous. And for everybody listening, The Intimacy Experiment is available on April 6th. We will be reviewing it and discussing it in one of our April episodes. So something to look forward to then. But for now, thanks for listening. Thanks so much for listening. Boobies and Newbies is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts. You can follow Boobies and Newbies on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Boobies Podcast.